All right, let's get started on this session. So welcome everybody to the session on mobility. And first, let me introduce and thank my co-chair, Sara, Adar, from University of Michigan. So we'll be doing this together. So I wanted to provide a short introduction and then try to maximize the time for the available speakers. So as you all remember, not that long ago, life was normal. This was like February, early March 2020. We were all doing the things that we usually do. And then we started hearing news of something that was going around, some infectious disease that we didn't really know anything about. And then in early March, depending on where you lived, it was either early March or mid-March or sometimes even late March, you were told to buy more toilet paper, which was hard to get. You were told to perhaps work from home if you could. And eventually you were, in many states and in many countries, you were told to stay home as much as possible, with some exceptions. So what you see here is just a graphic showing the introduction of social distancing policies, interventions across US states. So in the yellow dots, you have the declarations of emergency. In the next color over, you see a state start mandating school closures, which turned out to be completely ineffective and probably harmful to our kids, but we didn't know that at the time. Bans on large gatherings, restaurant and business closures, all the way to shelter in place or stay at home orders. And so, of course, this impacted what we did. That was the point. The point was to, they called social distancing policies because they were meant to keep us home and keep us away from other people. And what you can see here is data from Google community mobility reports. And full disclosure, at the time I was a visiting scientist at Google and I still received consulting income from them. But what you see here is the axis there got cut off, but it's the percent change in the time people spend away from home. And so the zero is obviously, the pre-pandemic level. And then as restrictions increased here in New York County, which is, New York City area, there's increasingly people are spending less time away from home. And then on the right side there, what you see is for every county in the US, you can see that we substantially spent more time at home, so a reduction in the time spent away from home and a reduction in the number of trips spent to work, to recreational outlets, to transit hubs, to grocery stores, and a smaller reduction to visits to parks, with a lot of variation. Europe saw the same thing. So here's the policy interventions in Europe in a slightly different format, and the categorization of restrictions was different. This is from the Oxford policy tracker. That data was available at the time across several countries in Europe. And so you can see that as COVID cases rose in specific countries, there were increasing restrictions placed on people's mobility.
I think it's on that list.
Somebody's.
I think it's on that.
Oh, got it. Sorry. So as we had increasing cases, we had increasing restrictions on people's mobility across Europe, with quite a bit of heterogeneity across the countries. And again, you see the change in mobility. And this is again from the Google mobility reports, the percent change in time spent away from home. And you can see that there was, this tremendous heterogeneity, with Italy and Spain showing, large reductions in the time people spent away from home, and Sweden and Germany relatively less so. So reflective of the different approaches to social distancing policies. Okay, so what are the consequences of this? So we changed how we lived, how we moved, and how we worked, or where we worked. And this had some really positive benefits. So this is just one of the many examples from around the world at the time. So this is an article from the New York Times from 2020, showing that India actually, Delhi actually does have blue skies when the air pollution is removed. And so there were a number of stories like this. And in fact, this is, again, just one of the many studies that quantified using sort of very recent data at the time, decreases in NO2 levels on the left and PM2.5 levels on the right, no pronounced changes in ozone levels. So this is, across 30 or so countries. And if you see on the relative scale, so the relative change, there were in many countries, there were really large decreases in NO2, in the order of 50% decreases or more, to, smaller decreases in PM 2.5, again, with heterogeneity across countries, but really changed the air pollution landscape. And this is, a really interesting part of this is that those countries, so here each dot is a country, those countries that had the biggest decreases in mobility had also the biggest decreases in on air pollution. And the two panels are just different markers of mobility from Apple on the right and Google on the left. So that's super interesting, but then, that's at the country level. And when you zoom in, one of the themes today has been about, equity and how the benefits of air pollution reductions are or are not accruing equitably across communities. So this is some very recent work from Susan Annenberg's group and showing that the variation while NO2 levels went down dramatically, they went down differently in different communities. And so this is examples from New York, Atlanta, and Detroit. And this is sort of the variation from the citywide average. So you can see some neighborhoods benefited much more than other neighborhoods. So the question is, of course, well, which neighborhoods benefited the most? And I really can't say it better than the lay abstract of this paper, which says the least white communities experienced the largest NO2 reductions during lockdowns. However, disparities between the least and most white communities are so large that the least white communities still faced higher NO2 levels during lockdowns than the most white communities experienced prior to the lockdowns, despite an approximate 50% reduction in passenger vehicle traffic. So everybody benefited. Some people benefited much more than others, and this still leaves a lot of inequities. So really important to consider not just the overall average reductions, but where those benefits accruing and where there's work left to go. So in today's session, we're going to hear from this fantastic panel of speakers on how the pandemic affected how we move, where we work, where we go, and the mechanisms to get there, and the impacts on life in the present and into the future. So we're going to hear from Gloria Jeff from the Minnesota Department of Transportation, Travis Freed from University of Washington, Benjamin Leard from University of Tennessee, and Bill Eisele from Texas A&M. So with that in mind, let me turn it right away to introduce our first speaker. So our first speaker is Gloria Jeff, AICP. She's an experienced transportation executive, professional, and urban planner. She's also co-chair of the National Academy's Transportation Research Board's Committee on Transportation Equity, and currently serves as the Minnesota DOT Metro District's Livability Director. Ms. Jeff holds a BSc and MSc in Civil Engineering and a Master of Urban Planning from the University of Michigan. She's an active member of the American Institute of Certified Planners, the American Planning Association, and the Conference of Minority Transportation Officials. Please give a warm welcome to Gloria.
Good morning. Let me try that again. I like to know that my audience is awake. Good morning. It's good to see everybody. Now you have a name to go with that obnoxious person who kept asking questions. I'm excited to be here in my capacity as a co-chair for the Transportation Research Board's Committee on Transportation and Equity. In that capacity, we focus on research, we focus on education, and quite candidly, we focus on what do we need to do to translate that research into something a practitioner like myself at a DOT can do, or metropolitan planning organization can do in evaluating its projects and programs to local communities, whether they are urban or rural, and translate this whole issue of equity. Because indeed, as the deputy administrator has said, this administration has made equity one of its most important priorities. And while we all want to talk about equity, I'm going to roughly guesstimate that there are about 100 people in this room. I'm willing to bet there are 110 definitions of what is equity. And so as we wrestle with this issue of equity and how to address it, it is about more than disparities. It is more than just race. It is more than just ethnicity. It has to do with geography. It has to do with urban versus rural, north versus south, east versus west. It has to do with what modes do you choose. It has to do with issues like, are we going to, does my community care about having limited amount of reflections into the atmosphere so that we can see the stars at night? All of those become important when we talk about equity, because it's real easy to say, oh, I got 15 people in the room, 3 of whom are African American, 5 of whom are of Hispanic background, and the balance are from what we define as members of the white race. And voila, we have diversity. Well, not really. And we definitely don't have equity in the conversations. But let me move on to, is it this one? Big green button. Oh, went too far. Okay, just again to kind of reinforce what you heard from Greg, this is what happened in the Twin Cities area just before the pandemic is what you see on the far left. And then as you move through, you begin to see that we had tremendous drops in the volume of traffic on the freeways in the metropolitan area, and that we still have not recovered. What that is translated to for us, however, is a circumstance where we have about returned to normal in our PM volumes, but what we don't have is a return in our AM. We have seen our AM peaks spread out. And that's an important phenomenon because it used to be, oh, okay, we have toll lanes in the Twin Cities area. So we knew when the volumes were going to be there. But because we have a dozen or more Fortune 500s headquartered in the Twin Cities, in particular in Minneapolis, most of those folks are working from home. But what we also saw was that there were some other changes that took place over time. Let's see if we'll move.
Big green button.
Big green button, that's the problem. We've seen some changes in travel over the last several decades. In the 1960s, there was this move to everybody comes into work except for the maids, and every transit agency in America had a series of maid routes that were what we called in those days counterflow. Everybody else came into the city and the maids went out to take care of the houses. And there were those routes clearly established in public transportation, and then they reversed in the evening. There have been and continue to be manufacturing in what I grew up in Detroit calling shift work, which meant no, they didn't work from 8 to 5. They came in at 7 in the morning, worked until mid-afternoon. So you saw a peaking period begin in advance of 4 o'clock. That peaking period was concluded by 5 or so, which is when you then caught the downtown workers coming home. We had family road trips back in those days. We also had the ability to look at what was redlining doing in terms of where people could live. This idea that, oh, okay, people can move to live in different locations was not only not true in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, or even the 1990s. There are restrictive covenants in place today in titles. They're unenforceable, but there are still titles in this country that explicitly state that people of a particular racial background or ethnic background cannot reside on that property as a permanent resident. In the 1970s, we saw the great gas shortages. We saw the passage of the National Environmental Policy Act and the focus on protecting the natural environment. And let's be very clear that while the intent of those who wrote NEPA was to have a broad interpretation of the environment, the initial work and much of the work today continues to focus on the natural environment. We want to make sure that the air is clean, that the water is pure, that there are suitable locations for fish and fauna and animals. There was not the attention given to the social, economic, and I'm trying to find the right word here, for the non-natural environment components of the environment. So that's where we were in the 1970s. In the 1980s, we had a Great Recession, and we saw the Clean Air Act amendments put forward by Congress and finally adopted. In the 1990s, there was finally an acknowledgement, voila, we have the greatest transportation system on the planet. And the cornerstone of that was the interstate highway system, and Congress declared victory in the mid 1990s and said, we're done constructing. We're not done with maintaining and operating it, but we're done in our role of providing construction dollars. That really began to change how people traveled, why they traveled, and when. We also saw in the 1970s the introduction of dollars from the Highway Trust Fund into public transportation. We also saw in the 1990s an explicit call for state highway departments or state transportation agencies to become part of what needed to happen in providing multimodal transportation. In the 2000s, we see the rise of climate change and the call for sustainability without necessarily having found answers to many of the problems that we saw over the passage of time. Interesting things occurred between the pandemic and today. Some of them include the fact that we saw fewer overall trips. Yay, air quality should have gotten better. Notice I said should have, because in addition to fewer trips being made, VMT going down, what we began to see was an increase in the number of fatalities. We were doing a better job of killing one another in automobiles. Reason being, the volumes were down. People felt like they could operate more heavily and more quickly in those vehicles. We also saw an increase in used automobile sales. And that's an important piece because public transit in many communities was completely shut down. There was this fear of interacting with other people and becoming victims of the virus. And so we found ourselves in this interesting dilemma of actually increasing. But because they were used vehicles, they didn't necessarily have all of the great new bells and whistles that made them friendly to air quality. We also saw an increase in bike sales. Yay, people were doing other modes of transportation. The data has been inconclusive whether or not those additional bikes were being used for work and household maintenance kind of trips, or whether they were just there for recreational purposes as people sought excuses to get out of the house in ways that were safe. We saw an uptick, surprise, surprise, in the number of package delivery services and in the number of trips associated with that, as well as curbside pickups. People's desire to be out and about didn't necessarily get reflected in that. Instead, what we saw was their unwillingness to interact with other human beings. But if it meant I could go to the grocery store and pick up my groceries that somebody else had shopped for, if it meant that I was getting dinner for my family, I could do so without ever having to step into an environment where there were a large number of other people. But what that did was we suddenly saw, I shouldn't say suddenly, we saw an uptick in the amount of traffic in residential areas that had not been there before. We also began to see at the same time a decline in the options for essential workers. There's always this conversation about let people ride public transportation. That's fine if you work between the hours that most transit systems operate, which is ignore New York, LA, and Boston for a minute. But for many of the other systems, their earliest service is somewhere between 5:30 and 6 in the morning. And there are individuals who have work requirements, for example, skilled tradesmen, carpenters, resteel folks who work on construction sites. Transit starting at 5:30 or 6 in the morning isn't going to get them to work on time. Those who work in hospitals and are working 10-hour or 12-hour shifts, again, find themselves in this predicament of either at the beginning of their shift or at the end of their shift, public transportation is not an option. Those who work as bus drivers, this for me was the sort of dumb moment. It's like, okay, the bus driver should use public transit to get to work. How do they get folks for that AM pullout when public transit isn't working yet? Yet there was this sort of aha moment where people went, oh, That's not going to work. So we saw all of this in the COVID environment. So how and why people move is a fairly complex issue. It's not a gimme. The decisions are driven not just by, I need to get to point A, but they are driven by things like, why do I need to get to point A and what else do I need to do while I am out and about? We need to look at the varied locations, the durations. There are some that are, it's no longer the home to work trip that we used to talk about when we did our modeling work. It's the home to work, to whatever I need to do to maintain the household that evening, or home to, I need to drop by, pick your favorite location to do something in the morning before I show up at the office. But home and office have now become the same thing for many parts of the population. So that whole travel phenomenon, and I'm going to stop using my hands, becomes a very different dynamic than we've had in the past, because home and work have now been combined for many, or we still have the traditional travel for those involved in skilled trades or who are essential workers. The perception of safety, healthiness, and availability of travel options becomes very real. Even after transit agencies began to operate again, people tended, and still to this day, continue to shy away from them as choices because of the fact that they don't perceive that that necessarily is a healthy environment, even if there are still mask requirements in that particular community. And then this whole issue of workforce. How do we match up those of us who are privileged to work from home and those who have to get out every day to care and see about us? And somehow or another, we have to begin to factor those as we talk about mobility, as we talk about traveling from point A to point B. The reasons aren't universal, or as Mr. Spock would say, in this context, the needs of the many don't define the needs of the few or the one. So things that influence it, I was fascinated in the first session as we talked about land use and that not being an area. The reality is land use has a real impact on how we travel and why we travel. The reality is if I live close enough to where I work, where I could walk or ride my bike, yay. But again, I'm a college educated, well-spoken member of the professional society. My child, who is a master craftsman as a carpenter, guess what? His workplace doesn't allow him to work from home. He's involved in vertical and horizontal construction activities. He's got to travel to a site. So guess what? Land use makes a difference because where's the construction taking place? And how long is it going to take to do the piece of work that he has to do? So land use in terms of where's new development occurring doesn't necessarily correspond to where people live or own. The whole issue of housing availability is a huge issue in almost every major metropolitan area. There is a tremendous squeeze on housing and affordability. The lower waged individuals have much greater commute distances and are much less able to deal with the time penalty associated with public transportation. Risky behavior, again, we saw the increase in the number of fatalities. It's because there's riskier behavior. I've worked a 9 or 10 hour shift. I'm going to go to my part-time job because it allows me to supplement my income. But now I've been in a work environment for 16 hours and I still got to go home. I'm engaging in fatigued driving and I'm more willing to do that. And that results in greater opportunity for crashes to occur. And then again, as I said, the whole issue of the attention to the needs of the few or the one and not just those of the many. We love to aggregate data up. Unfortunately, because of the diversity of issues around mobility, aggregating up doesn't necessarily give you the good picture. Alan Pizarski did a wonderful job in Commuting in America as he tracked changes between the censuses over a 4-decade period in which it was very clear that when you aggregate up, you don't get the number of drivers flatline. What you didn't get in that by aggregating up was that the number of women who were obtaining their driver's license was significantly greater than they had been over each of those decades. And that was because when you aggregate up, you get the flatlining of the phenomenon. Oh, I've actually gotten through sort of final thoughts. You've heard it from EPA, you'll hear it from the Transportation Research Board, and you'll hear it from others, that this whole issue of equity has to be top of the chain. There are no, guess what my name is and why should I care about equity? Equity is critical because it shapes how the service is received, how people move, why they move, what opportunities needs to be there. We need to make absolutely sure that when we talk about solutions that we don't do slogans. Reduce VMT, reduce VMT. Wonderful slogan. But what does that look like if you don't have a white collar job that lets you work from home? If you don't live in a community where tourism is how you live and die, as we look at rising costs associated with air travel and with train travel. So what is that family going to do if it wants to continue? It's going to go back to the phenomenon of the 1960s called family road trips. So what does that do? We need to understand that transportation is not just about getting from point A to point B, but it's about accessing opportunities. And who needs to access those opportunities and how do they receive them become important. This whole issue of making sure that everybody has a fair chance at accessing opportunity needs to be predicated on the idea that everybody doesn't need the same thing to get the outcome. An example being, in my household, I'm the shortest person in the house. And while I might need a step ladder to get to the top shelf, to get the bowl that my oldest child thought it would be funny to watch me climb up to get, because he's 6'4", he just puts his hand up and puts it there. He needs no help to get to that particular bowl. My middle child, or my second child, is at 5'8", and so he needs a little step stool in order to get to that top shelf. Whereas I need the step ladder. The outcome that we want is the same, but we needed different levels of help to get to that outcome. That's the critical piece to think about in equity. That's the critical piece to think about in transportation. It isn't about, oh, we cleaned up the air, but at what cost? And what are the consequences of that? Did we add more green space? Did we eliminate, pick your favorite undesirable land use? Did that create an opportunity for those with better income to move into those areas and displace? So it isn't just a sort of, here's my little piece of the puzzle. It's the integrated piece. It's what the deputy administrator talked about in terms of EPA has a specific charge, but it also understands it has to bring others to the table. That's the focus as we talk about equity. That's the focus as we talk about moving from point A to point B. It's not just how do I get from point A to point B, but why do I need the travel and who needs to be involved? And I have time for questions.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we have time for one or two clarifying questions.
Hi, Chad Bailey from EPA's Office of Transportation and Air Quality. What you said sounds great. How do you turn that into action in state DOTs and MPOs? How do you say include equity? If we're, I know in California, they decided they wanted to, for greenhouse gases, they got rid of level of service and they put in reduce, VMT. How do highway planners think about taking this stuff and turning it into their work?
Interestingly enough, in the Minnesota Department of Transportation and the people who actually pay my salary, I'm their livability director in their metropolitan district. We have 7 principles on which we call our livability framework, which moves us away from just being focused on infrastructure, but focusing on issues like sense of place, safety/security, which is, can grandma walk down the street without tripping over the sidewalk because the root system from the trees fell over, as opposed to what we traditionally think of as safety. It means focusing on how do we build trust in those communities and dealing with that issue of equity that I described, which is, it isn't just about did everybody got the same outcome. It's what did you do to help everybody get the same outcome? It's focusing on connections. It's focusing on safety, security, sense of place. What does that community feel like? What does it want to be? How does it shape itself to do that? and using that on what will clearly be, pick your favorite 9-figure number, project that we're doing on an interstate between downtown St. Paul and downtown Minneapolis. We're doing, it's going to take us several years to get to the end of it. We spent the first 2 years just talking to people about how do you use transportation and what do you want to do. We are now into the environmental process. It's not quick, but we're introducing these ideas of the livability framework in our decision-making about what happens with our design stages. It's a slow process, but it says put it on the table and let's talk about it.
Great, thank you. So really quick clarifying question and then we need
Yeah,
to.
Angie Shaddis, US EPA. My comment, it's a comment and a question, and that is I think you're spot on, of course, with all the equity considerations. And I'm a bicycle commuter, and I realize that I'm quite privileged to be able to do that. And at a local level, we just talked about the state level, but at the local level, as we have community discussions, there are people in certain communities who say, I don't want a bike lane because it's going to, as you say, gentrify. And what I want to do is have a positive, I want to figure out how we can have those equity conversations, especially at the local level. Like, what are the things, how can we have these positive conversations regarding alternative transportation that everybody can participate and we come to a win-win situation?
Part of it is very simply recognizing the legitimacy of those who may be opposed to it and their rationale. It may be, bike lane would be great, but I'm an African American and I'm 4 times more likely to be killed in a bike lane than you. Or I'm twice as likely to be stopped by law enforcement while I'm riding my bike. Those are legitimate concerns. And acknowledging that those are legit concerns, or it may be you're going to spend, pick your favorite dollar figure on a bike lane. I'd rather see an increase in transit service, and accepting that their needs are as legitimate as yours, as opposed to how do I convince them to come around to my point of view.
That's great. Thank you so much. Next, I'd like to welcome Travis Freed, who's a PhD candidate in transportation engineering at the University of Washington and a researcher at the Urban Freight Lab. His research focuses on the delicate balance between our demand for timely, affordable goods and need for clean air, thriving communities, and equitable access to core goods and services. In the past, he's worked as a state and local policy researcher at the University of Minnesota, a planner for the Minnesota Department of Transportation, and a transport sustainability researcher at the World Resources Institute in Washington, D.C. Travis, welcome.
Thank you, everyone. My name is Travis Freed. What I want to be talking about today is the intersection of land use, specifically warehousing as it relates to e-commerce and transportation. Oftentimes we talk about transportation as if it's siloed from land use. I want to be talking about how those intersect and what are the implications for air pollution, urban freight flows, as well as what it means for the communities who live near warehouses, as well as the equity implications. So just to start talking about the history of logistics land use then and now, this is a picture of the Port of Seattle in 1912 from the Historical Society. What we can see here is that we have a port, right? One of the largest ports in Washington next to Tacoma. We see a lot of concentration of industrial activity around that port. All of that industrial activity, all of that zoning is still there to this day. We have the Duwamish River corridor going south as well as going up north, which is the SODO warehousing district. It generally concentrated around very dense urban areas by railroads, by ports, but we've seen a few changes since then. First is just the sheer size of warehousing, both in terms of square footage, as well as just the number of buildings. In 2018, US warehouses surpassed office buildings as the dominant commercial and industrial land use, representing 18 billion square feet in floor space. This is from the US Energy Information Agency, as a lot of manufacturing either moved out of the city, moved into the suburbs, or moved overseas, or just shut down completely, depending where you lived. All of these activities were replaced traditionally by warehousing or just simply left. I think it's very surprising. I think we see it a lot in the news of just Amazon or other e-commerce related industries buying up formerly abandoned or formerly underutilized infrastructure to build up warehouses. And we see this both just in terms of the number of them, but they're also growing larger. Another trend is not just are they locating, but where they're locating. So in Seattle, we have the Duwamish River Corridor, but moving further south, we have something called the Kent-Renton Industrial Corridor. This is about 15 kilometers from the urban center. This is something we're seeing all over the country. It's been happening for the past 20 to 40 years. There's a word for it called logistics sprawl. Probably familiar with urban sprawl, but it's basically the suburbanization of warehousing activity. These warehouses require a lot of space, often up to 380,000 square feet, sometimes even more. And they're generally moving away from the urban center, but still serving that urban center. And we'll see some of the effects of that in this presentation. So I don't think we can talk about logistics land use without talking about the history of it, as well as the discriminatory and racial history of the placement of environmentally hazardous land uses. We can go back to the early 20th century with city zoning ordinances, which could arguably be one of the most important decisions that cities have made that inform how cities are organized to this day. They're still a very important part of where land use is located in the city and how those decisions are made. And many of these early policies, developers as well as policymakers, including other private sector members, including lenders, insurers, baked in discrimination, often to protect explicitly or implicitly homeowner property values. Gloria mentioned racial covenants. This is an example, just to turn that into reality, of a racial covenant in Minneapolis in 1940. These were written explicitly and hard-coded in the deeds that dictated who you can and cannot sell to, often with racially coded language. This is from a project in Minneapolis called Mapping Prejudice, where they actually digitized and mapped all of these racial covenants into the city and where that looked like. And what they found is that a lot of these covenants still stand, although not explicitly enforced. They're located generally where segregation is largely to occur in the city to this day. What we find too, this is related to housing, but we see very similar patterns when it comes to industrial zoning, which is concentrated in predominantly Black and immigrant communities. As mentioned before, even though this is not explicitly legal, path dependency has locked in many of these land use patterns into modern day. So now moving into e-commerce, right? We've seen a rise of e-commerce, not just in the past decade, but specifically a spike due to COVID. This is generally moderated a little bit, plateaued, but we're still seeing a rapid acceleration of how many goods we are ordering online. So again, the question becomes, do we see a disparate siting of e-commerce UDCs or urban distribution centers? This is a picture from a media report in Guardian, which is an Amazon facility in Gage Park, Chicago. There's a few things I want to point out. The first is this is an Amazon delivery station. This is their last mile station before it goes to your house. We see that this is in an urban area, which almost seems counter to what we've seen nationally, where warehouses are not just in the suburbs. Are they moving back into the central city? We see a lot of sensitive land uses around these warehouses. We see high schools, middle schools, elementary schools, and a lot of residential density around it. We also see that the majority of the populations who live near this warehouse, 88%, are Hispanic. This is very anecdotal, very contextual, but we can look at examples all over the country where this is occurring. There's not a lot of research on specifically related to e-commerce, but we have some research that we can learn from past on just warehousing in general. This is some findings from reports by Juan Yuan, who was a researcher at University of Southern California. His research found that warehousing disproportionately located in populations of color, POC majority populations, the effects of income were mixed. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. The effect was one way. Marginalized populations preceded the opening of warehouses, not the other way around. So did warehouses come in and then lower median household values? Or was it that the warehouse moved in where these populations were already established? This was found to be one way. What it did not analyze, however, were the environmental impacts. And this is crucial, right? So freight and air pollution are inherently connected. I don't need to talk about the health effects. I'm sure everyone here is very familiar. But I think what is less understood is just what is the role of freight in air pollution. There's a lot of contextual studies. There's a handful of studies that look at specific geographies of diesel exhaust from trucks. One in Toronto found that diesel exhaust represents 55% of all NOx emissions within an urban center. So it makes up an outsized proportion of mobility source pollutions, as well as just pollutions at large, despite the fact that freight and trucks generally make up 10% of vehicle VMT nationally. So a small amount of trucks, but a large size impact. So we're getting into the research question of the work that I'm interested in, the work that I'm focusing on as a PhD candidate. And that is, what does the spatial organization of e-commerce related urban distribution centers mean for equity and environmental justice? So to start, we're going to look at measuring e-commerce emissions in King County, Washington, which is home to Seattle and some of its largest suburbs. So to understand that, we need to look at what the logistics supply chain looks like for Amazon, for home delivery providers. I point out Amazon just because it's the largest and certainly the elephant in the room. Typically, we're looking at the final two legs of deliveries. So we're looking at the regional sortation center, which is typically located generally a little outside of the city. It handles a massive amounts of packages. Those are the facilities you see on the conveyor belts with packages moving all over the place. They are very large. They're served by Class 8 trucks. And from there, they are put out to last mile delivery stations. These are generally serving residents at the zip code level. They're generally closer to the customer, although not always. This is where we see the diesel cargo vans living, as well as where they're routed. And then, of course, there's the home consumers. So I'm coming into this with two hypotheses. The first is that the most vulnerable, the most marginalized communities are more likely to live further upstream in the logistics supply chain, typically by these sortation centers, as well as some of these warehouses, the delivery stations. And number two, that this generally exposes these populations to more emissions. So it's a very simplistic geometry question, right? So we have a few data sources. One is Amazon UDC locations and package volumes, emission factors for diesel cargo vans and Class 8 trucks. We're looking at NOx and PM specifically. This is very preliminary in terms of our results. So we're just looking at very basically what are some of the mission outcomes, and then we're going to create and add sophistication to what this model looks like. So just starting out very basically, we made a lot of assumptions. The first is Euclidean distance linkages. Fully loaded vehicles and trucks typically aren't fully loaded, although companies often wish they were. They spend, I believe, about 33% of the time driving around empty, depending on which city. We're not looking at atmospheric dispersion. Trip assignments proportional to population. This is a major assumption. As we know, not everyone orders packages equally. And then finally, destinations are population weighted zip code centroids. This is something we're changing. So we're just looking at census tracts only. We're not looking at where those trucks go or those diesel cargo vans go when they're within the census tract. Okay, so there's a lot of assumptions here, right? And these are something that we're working on methodologically and we'll be working on for the next month. But generally what we see is that the methodology assumptions undercount the effect of cargo van and truck VMT. Just keep that in mind. It's a big grain of salt before we move into the results. So first, what we found is that lower incomes and higher POC percentages correlated with UDC intensity. This is a map of the percent of POC census tracts, or how many high populations of non-white populations of color live within a census tract, as well as where the warehouses are located and what their package volume looks like. So you can already see naturally where a lot of these warehouses are located. The bright orange is where that Duwamish River corridor is, and further south into Renton, that's what we can see looking like when we map that out. And then what we also find is when we just look at specifically where those UDCs are located, that populations exposed to 3 or 4 UDCs had 42% lower median income, or 42% lower median incomes and 86% higher POC concentrations than non-exposed populations. So the question is, what does that mean for emissions? So we have 3 charts here. We have high white to low white and low non-white, mid white and mid non-white. The bottom here, looking at VKT, PM, and NOx. So first, what we found is that POC majority populations were more exposed than white populations, regardless of income. So you can see mid non-white was some of the highest exposure, as well as then following low non-white, shortly followed by low white and mid white. And then high white, you see, is among the lowest. We did not find a statistically significant relationship between middle and low income POC groups. And then finally, middle mile trucks had a higher variable emission impact for POC pops than cargo vans. You can see that generally the orange cargo vans has a relatively equal amount of exposure to some of the non-highway income groups. But we can see a lot of variation for Class 8 trucks. These are the trucks that are serving the regional warehouses to the last mile delivery stations. So just to summarize that a little bit, this is an Amazon facility, by the way, in Tijuana, Mexico. Higher UDC intensity correlated with low income and high POC concentrations. POCs were more exposed to emissions than white populations, regardless of income, especially from middle mile trucks. But between POC groups, the effects of income was mixed. This is actually in line with past environmental justice research, as well as ongoing national level research that racial makeup often had a stronger effect on the disparate industrial siting, often more than socioeconomic status. And this is another research question that we're looking at here. Another reason that we suspect is that opportunistic suburban municipalities encourage more UDC development, possibly exposing middle-class populations of color, middle-class communities. Kent and Renton is one of those suburbs in Seattle. Oftentimes regulations for warehousing are generally just coded into zoning policies, and oftentimes there generally isn't an environmental provision, and warehouses are traditionally treated more ad hoc as to whether or not a warehouse will be located there. Sometimes environmental considerations aren't even really considered. The suburban municipalities that encourage this development, they often have higher percentages of industrial zoning, and the parcel sizes of those industrial zonings are larger. These warehouses require a lot of space. We also see not only that this makes it more amenable for warehouse development, but a lot of suburban municipalities will encourage UDC development either through direct or indirect subsidies, as well as an economic driver. We see this specifically with just how a lot of these last mile delivery stations are sprawling or suburbanizing. Last mile delivery stations built after 2020 are 5 kilometers more dispersed from population centers. This is from another research study that we're conducting. What this means is just where are they located within the city? What we found principally is this purple refers to just urban core cities, so the largest city within a metropolitan statistical area. And then the brown refers to suburban municipalities. We see in 2013 to 2015, this is Amazon, 910 Amazon facilities. There was a large spike in urban facilities, Amazon moving into the urban center. This roughly stayed static throughout the 2010s with a few spikes, but we also see at the same time a large amount of suburbanization of these same facilities. We see Amazon expanding into suburban areas, both to serve those suburban markets, but also for some of the land use trends that we've talked about. So after a major spike in Central City last mile delivery station 2015, last mile delivery stations suburbanized at twice the rate they urbanized. And so then our ongoing research question is, what does UDC equity look like for suburbs versus urban areas at a national scale? So as mentioned, I'm a research assistant for the Urban Freight Lab, and Goodchild is my advisor. A lot of the solutions we focus on are very tactical, specifically for last mile delivery. We see cargo bikes and micro hubs and parcel lockers. Often these are proposed as solutions that seek to improve efficiency for last mile deliveries in dense urban areas. What you found is that a lot of the emissions are coming from warehousing development, since they concentrate all of that vehicle flow. And we found that generally this is where large populations of marginalized communities live. So what are some of the equity outcomes of the solutions that we are proposing, the solutions that probably come to mind when we think of sustainable urban freight solutions? And how do we address equity? And that's an open question. I'm very interested to hear everyone's thoughts. And when we look at exactly, well, what are some of the solutions? What is being addressed? There are some considerations moving forward, often untested. But we emphasize upchain environmental mitigation, looking further up the distribution channels, looking at warehousing, looking at truck flows. For the government, providing guidances, providing best practices and coordination to municipalities who are often in charge of their own destination or own destiny when it comes to land use, as well as some of the UDC targeted air quality regulations. Southern California has introduced a policy targeting emission reporting and emission mitigation at warehouse facility sites. New York State also introduced a policy in 2022. as well as incorporating the voices of advocates and environmental justice communities on the ground who have a very clear idea of the pulse and what's going on. Where warehouses are located, we all benefit from where they're located. We all benefit from the goods they deliver us, but trying to have a very sensitive ear to what is the localized impact of these facilities. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that very interesting talk. I think we do have time for a question or two if you'd like now. Oh yeah, great.
It's perhaps more a clarification question. I was curious within the stream of delivering parcels, whether fulfillment centers play any role in that stream. So
yeah.
And are these starting to crop up more, and are they starting to crop up in particular locations? Yeah.
Absolutely. So fulfillment centers, which is the start of Amazon fulfillment, one of the earliest warehouse type that Amazon introduced. They are the second most prevalent warehousing type next to last mile delivery stations. They're very much in the picture. They're generally sorted to where they go regionally within a larger mega region of cities to the sortation center. We are not looking at upstream emissions from there just because it's harder to connect the dots of where fulfillment centers deliver to in the city. So we do know where last mile delivery stations are delivering to. They're going to home consumers. We can model that a little bit more clearly. We do know that sortation centers connect the last mile delivery stations from last mile delivery stations to the regional fulfillment center. Fulfillment centers are massive and they're huge generators of truck traffic. So it is very important to consider exactly what is the volume of trucks going to and from. They're generally co-located with a lot of sortation centers and delivery stations as well. So if we map and measure the effect of e-commerce related warehouses, we generally see a co-located concentration of all types of facilities, both in Amazon warehousing in general. Amazon typically locates where other warehouses are as well. So if we do target, okay, the last mile leg of the delivery chain, especially upstream, we are also focusing on other types of warehousing, other types of facilities as well.
Hi, Mike Lehman, UC Davis. Not my field, but just interested. What role does automation, artificial intelligence sort of have on this in the future? I would imagine that some of these warehouses are located not only proximity to where they're going to deliver, but also where their workforce is. Yeah. And as that all changes, how is that going to sort of affect all this?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, especially when we're looking at why some of the municipalities will encourage UDC development is for these economic effects that warehouses move in. Generally, warehouses at large are still operating on highly legacy systems. Automation will come, but it's coming at a very slow rate. Amazon's a little bit of a different beast. However, a lot of these centers, specifically fulfillment centers, less so on some of their other facility sites, are highly automated. This does not necessarily mean that there's a lower workforce within these facilities. It does mean, however, that these are very highly efficient facilities. There's higher package volumes. And for a lot of the people who are working there, generally just through media reports that we've seen, working conditions are considered less than ideal. However, there are some economic effects that municipalities are encouraging. Automation will be something that's very interesting to come, even though Amazon does represent a little bit of a different industry and beast than I would say warehousing in general. Yeah, it's something that's very important when it comes to the municipality perspective. What are some of the cost benefits of a warehouse locating in my facility or in my neighborhood? And especially as automation takes hold, what will that mean for the people who work there and some of the jobs that are in those facilities? Yeah, thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so very much for such an interesting talk. All right, next up, we would like to welcome Benjamin Leard. So Benjamin is an assistant professor in the Agriculture and Resource Economics Department and a faculty fellow in the Howard H. Baker Jr. Center for Public Policy at the University of Tennessee. His research focuses on economic analysis of environmental issues, including climate change and electric vehicle adoption. In the past, he worked as a research fellow at Resources for the Future here in Washington, D.C., and his work has been published in leading economic journals and has been cited in the popular press, including the Washington Post. And he will be talking to us about exploring the role of electric vehicles in future mobility.
Thank you for having me. This works forward. Got it. Thank you. All right. This work is a kind of a work in progress, and it's co-authored with David Green, also at UT. And we're going to be looking at really what role does electric vehicles, what role do they play in reducing vehicle pollution? Kind of focusing more on what we like to call a stock turnover problem. Basically, we have a large stock of on-road cars and how we're going to get them all off and replaced with new fuel-efficient vehicles. So this is a figure from a recently published paper. These authors, Choma et al., back in 2021, not too long ago. And I like this figure a lot because it's basically plotting the social costs of emissions as well as benefits of emissions reductions in the last decade. And the left panel, focusing on the left panel first, there's different vehicle types. So we have LDV are light duty vehicles. So cars like cars and trucks that you and I drive. So focusing on that middle row here. And so what we see are, as of 2017, these are the costs of current emissions coming from cars and trucks. And so they're broken out by different types. We've got PM 2.5, SO2, NOx, as well as CO2. And what we can see from the current emissions profile is that CO2 is the largest source of cost. It's that kind of orangey color, beige color on the left there. And the other kind of thing that stands out to me from this figure is looking at the right panel, which are the benefits of reductions of emissions between, I believe it's 2008 to 2017, so about a 10-year period. And again, we see kind of a startling outcome here, which is that CO2 is kind of a small sliver. So it's the rightmost line there, and it's the smallest reduction. So even though we've seen substantial reductions in pollution for more local pollution, we don't really see the same thing for global CO2 emissions. And so that's some motivation for this talk will really be on focusing on greenhouse gas emission reduction from cars. More motivation for focusing on CO2 reductions is that our current administration, they have a pretty ambitious climate goal. The goal here is to reduce economy-wide emissions by about 50% relative in 2030. So about 8 years from now, relative to 2005 levels. This is in line with goals from the most recent IPCC report to limit warming by 1.5 degrees centigrade, which requires this 50% by 2030 reduction. And currently, transportation is the largest source of US greenhouse gas emissions. So getting them on board, getting reductions from this largest source is really, really important. Oops, back one. So how do electric vehicles kind of come into play? How do they help us, get to those targets? It's really kind of a two-prong approach here. So number one, getting our on-road fleet of vehicles to be electric, as well as kind of moving the electricity grid power plants to 100% clean electricity, so renewable sources. And so if we can combine these two, we can get a really large chunk of emissions reductions, since these two sources are the largest sources of CO2 within the entire country. So they're about 55% if we add those two together. Okay, there we go. So this is a figure, I like this figure, thinking about how do we transition the fleet, the on-road fleet of cars and trucks To electric, I like to look at this and think about this problem as like a bathtub. And so you kind of have typical bathtub, you have the actual bath water, which I like to think of as like the used vehicle stock. So there's about 270 million cars and trucks on the road today. So just remember that number. Less than 1% are electric vehicles. Now the spigot up here where the water's coming in, this is a lot like new vehicle sales. So that's about 15 million per year, of which about 5% were electric back in 2021. And then the final kind of exiting of the water, kind of the drain, is really like vehicle retirement. So scrappage of vehicles, every single year, vehicles are removed from the fleet and they're replaced by new vehicles. So you can see, comparing 15 million is a lot smaller than the existing stock. This stock is massive, right? It can take, 20 to 30 years to have the fleet turnover completely. And so it's really important to kind of think of this problem as this, using this bathtub analogy. Another issue with this issue of how do we get more EVs on the road is that vehicles are lasting longer. These are data from the NHTS. It's a big survey of home households and their travel. And so what we see here, there is 2 recent waves of the NHTS that were administered, one back in 2009 and one was in 2017. And what we see, this is the distribution of vehicles by age. And so we have the 2 surveys here. 2009 is the gray, so it's kind of more bunched near younger vehicles here, whereas the 2017 is the darker blue region, and we can see kind of an aging population of vehicles. So cars are lasting longer, which implies that it will take longer for the fleet to turn over and be replaced by new vehicles. So given that motivation, what we do in this paper is that we ask this question of how quickly can we replace the on-road vehicle stock with new electric vehicles, given kind of what we see in the data in terms of how quickly the stock can turn over. A secondary question is, how quickly can we reduce vehicle pollution, in particular CO2 emissions? And a third question is, how does the rate of electricity grid decarbonization, so kind of meanwhile in the background here, what we're seeing if we look at power plant emissions is that they're going down considerably, and there's expectations that they're going to continue to go down over time. And so what is the interplay between what's going on with power plants and this transition to electric vehicles that we expect to see? So in terms of methodology for our modeling that we do, we build what's called a stock turnover model. We pin the parameters of the model based on historical sales, registration data, which I'll talk about, as well as how quickly cars are scrapped or removed from the fleet. And we basically, we run the model for every year through 2075. So it's a projection exercise. And what we're doing is we're measuring changes in things like vehicle type shares. So the share of the on-road fleet that is electric versus hybrid versus gasoline, as well as things like VMT and CO2 emissions. We bring a lot of data together for this exercise. We merge together a bunch of different data sources. The big one, the primary data source is from a company called IHS Markit. They have a huge database of vehicle registrations. And so we bought the data. We have a big panel of it. And so we can compute these scrap rates with that data. We merge together that information with things like fuel economies. That's from Wards and fueleconomy.gov, as well as a few other important components. We have VMT from a survey. And so we bring together all these things to be able to measure CO2 changes over time. A critical piece of this exercise, given that we're projecting into the future here, is we need to make assumptions about scenarios for what will new vehicle sales look like. And so we have two, I would say, fairly ambitious projections. So one we kind of call the California goal or scenario, which is that 100% of the new market share will be EVs, 100% by 2035. That's California's goal. And maybe a more conservative scenario from industry would be to achieve that same 100% new EV market share by 2045. So a 10-year delay to get there. We also have to make assumptions about the electricity sector, what's happening with emissions from power plants. And so what we do is we take data from NREL. They have a 2021 set of scenarios projected out. And so we basically just take exactly what they report, what they project. The first one is a no new carbon policy scenario. That's the red line. So we have kind of a decline over time and then kind of a flat line by 2050. The second and third scenarios would involve having some type of carbon policies put in place. So getting a 95% reduction by 2050. And then the third, which is kind of the most ambitious, which would be a 95 reduction in CO2 by 2035. So a very, very fast decarbonization. So here are a couple slides of results that we have so far. This is, again, a work in progress. Very looking forward to questions and comments. And so let's focus on this left panel. And so this left panel is with the assumption of having 100% of new vehicle sales be electric by 2035. So kind of the California goal. And so kind of and what we do is we're plotting here over time. So through 2075, the share of vehicles that are on-road share by different fuel types. So we've got gasoline, hybrid, and electric. And so kind of one takeaway from this picture is that even when the new vehicle market share is 100% EV by 2035, the on-road share is a lot smaller than that. It's going to be around 30% by 2035. And this is because of this stock turnover dynamic. It takes a while to have gasoline vehicles be removed from the fleet. It's a very gradual process. We see something pretty similar with the right panel. It's just a slower transition. And so we see smaller, maybe about 20% or so of the on-road fleet are EVs by 2035 in that panel. Turning to CO2 emissions, what do those look like? And so here are the figures for that. Again, the left panel is the assumption of 100% new vehicle market share being EVs by 2035. And so kind of the two takeaways here. Number one, short run targets are going to be really hard to achieve. So focusing on this first dash line here in the left panel, 2030, we expect to see about a 20% reduction in passenger vehicle CO2 by 2030. And that really doesn't depend on very much. It's robust to whether we assume kind of a slower EV market share growth. And so we see about 20% in both scenarios. However, so that's kind of a pessimistic outcome, is that we're not going to get a huge amount of CO2 reductions within the next 8 years. However, by 2050, we can get a lot of reduction. And so we're looking at between 75 to 85% reduction. Again, kind of robust to what we assume about the inputs. And so that's, I think, pretty promising if we can get these EVs on the road today. And by 2035, getting to 100% would be great. To summarize so far what we've done in this work, so again, by 2035, only about a 20% reduction relative to 2020 levels. This really falls short of the current administration's goals for getting really deep decarbonization by 2030. However, by 2050, there's a lot more promise, 70 to 85% are possible, very promising. And then a kind of a third result is that thinking about the relationship between how power plants are decarbonizing and how that's going to affect emissions from transportation, we actually find that there's not very much relationship over time. And this is really good. This is really due to good timing. One benefit of having this delay effect from stock turnover. So basically, the grid that we have in our country will be cleaned up. We expect it to be much cleaner in the future by the time the on-road EV share is large. And so that's actually a good outcome. And so, concerns about, dirty emissions from the power plant sector, I think they actually will probably matter less over time. That's kind of what we expect from our results. So what are some policy implications? I would say to achieve these ambitious 2030 goals, we need to have more policy. We need to have something to increase the rate at which our stock of vehicles turns over. So things like a cash for clunkers program, maybe longer period, something to accelerate that process of churning over the fleet is really necessary. 2050 goals, these can probably be met, but we have to see this ramp up of electric vehicle sales, by 2035 or 2045. And so having a lot more subsidies for, purchases, we need to make these cars more affordable, more available to, typical consumer to really get this ramp up in EV sales. And so some work that we're thinking about doing once we wrap up this project is to kind of downscale. This entire work is really at the national level, and we want to kind of downscale it to, say, the zip code level to look at how will this transition affect communities differently, across income and race, and to look at more of the equity concerns with this transition to EVs. So with that, I think I'm all wrapped up, and thank you, and look forward to your questions.
Oh, thank you very much. I like the optimistic view of our future and where we might head. Yeah, I welcome some questions. It looks like we have a couple of folks coming up.
Hi there, Dan Greenbaum from the Health Effects Institute. That was great, and it's really nice to see this level of analysis. We actually had this issue of stock turnover has to be really continually thought about and understood. I wanted to take your analysis in a slightly different direction and ask about the capabilities of it. In our discussion with Jana McCabe, the issue of the old vehicles came up and where they end up. And I understood you were getting some data on scrappage. But I'm wondering if, in your understanding of the data sets that you have and others, if there is a way to understand what percentage of these older vehicles are getting exported. Because it seems to me that a good analysis that could show us how large that stream of vehicles is could be very helpful in trying to come up with rationales for more scrappage programs. I was impressed that I hadn't realized that the diesel bus replacement program, the new one, is saying you have to dismantle the old bus. That's great progress. But I'm just curious if the data sets, would even allow you to get that kind of information.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. As far as I know, we're not aware of if we're able to measure the kind of the exportation rate. We've had conversations with, so the primary source of data is from IHS. And as far as we've been told from them, most of it's just registration data. And so we don't actually know. What we observe is like, we observe a car being registered in 1 year, and then it's just kind of not in the data on the next year. And we treat that as like, every car that's not in the, it basically is dropped is being scrapped. And so it's an assumption that we have. We'd have to find something else to supplement our data to really look at that question, but it's a fantastic point.
Yeah, thanks.
Hey, Brian Hubble with EPA. So I wanted to explore a little bit the the potential impacts of charging infrastructure. You mentioned at the end sort of subsidies for individual charging stations, but for me personally, my own story is that we were looking to buy a electric vehicle, but we didn't feel comfortable with where we knew we needed to go on longer trips with being able to get frequent enough charging. So I wonder if you could speak to sort of not just the individual pieces of charging infrastructure, but the overall infrastructure and how that might affect the trends that you saw in terms of the ability to more rapidly turn over the fleet, because I think there's a little bit of push and pull that goes on with that. So I wonder if you could talk about that.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, charging infrastructure is a huge issue for a lot of households. You know, the one interesting thing about electric vehicles is that a lot of people that'll buy them will have access to home charging, but then a lot of people won't. You know, a lot of people in our country don't live in a detached house. They might live in an apartment. And so having a reliable, available, easy, accessible charging station, you know, network around where you live is super important. You know, I think one thing that makes me optimistic about this transition is that we are seeing significant increases in battery range over time. Even in like the last 10 years, I think the average range was, I don't remember off the top of my head, maybe like 100 or, you know, 150 miles per range or per charge, whereas now it's like 250 or almost 300 now. And so the longer the range we have, the less concern that'll become for a typical buyer. But still, no doubt, is a very, very important issue that remains. And so, you know, having more stations available, you know, we're not even close to having the same number of stations as there are gas stations, right? And so that will hopefully, we'll get there eventually, but, you know, it's going to take more subsidies and, you know, more demand for these things to get there. So.
Yeah, and do you see that the policies are being considered well enough now? Because it seems like it's going to take a time to build that out. And if you need that to match or proceed when you get the cars sold, maybe that needs to be a policy focus, is to make sure we're getting those charging stations.
Yeah, I think my understanding of, you know, Build Back Better, for example, there's a lot of money that would be in there. We'll see what happens, you know, if that actually happens, you know, we actually get that policy in place. But I think what has been proposed would be sufficient to really get us there. But, you know, there's a lot of empirical issues in terms of thinking about forecasting that. So a lot of work to be done for sure to understand, you know, get a better sense of that.
Thank you.
Hello, we have a few questions from the virtual audience. The first one is, I think, a quick one that's related to the previous. Are you seeing that many households that have an electric vehicle also have a gas-powered vehicle for longer trips, and is that affecting the trends at all?
Yeah, definitely. I haven't myself done a lot of work on looking at kind of this portfolio, how people choose. You know, most households have 2 or more vehicles. Like a lot of households have, I think the average number is 2, right? And so, you know, as such, you can think of this as a portfolio choice problem where you might buy one electric and then keep your other gasoline. My understanding of the literature on this is that a lot of households currently do that. They'll have one electric and then one or maybe multiple gasoline. And I kind of expect that to continue for the next few years, you know, but, you know, we'll see what happens.
Great, thank you. And we have a few questions that I'm going to combine because they're related on the life cycle. Have you done or know of anyone who's done life cycle analysis of replacing the current fleet with electric vehicles? There are questions about the carbon emissions from manufacturing a new vehicle compared to emissions during use, and the emissions and toxicity of materials in batteries and the production of those batteries.
I know that research exists. I'm not that familiar with the life cycle analysis. I do know that from a CO2 standpoint, you know, electric vehicles are, especially today with the much cleaner grid, even with all the life cycle emissions, they're much cleaner than a typical gasoline vehicle. But I know that research probably exists, but I can't point you to where, but it's out there for sure.
And thank you for the talk. Jana Milford from the University of Colorado. I wondered if you could briefly clarify what you assumed about the annual mileage of the vehicles and how that changes with the age of the vehicle.
Sure thing. Yeah. So our data are from, I think it's actually from IHS, which is used by the agencies in their analysis of the most recent fuel economy regulations. And so basically it's odometer data. And so to give you kind of a quick gist of what that looks like, over the lifetime of a vehicle, average annual miles traveled per vehicle goes down. And so it's around 12 or 13,000 miles per year for a new vehicle. And it gradually kind of goes to zero, over, I think on average, a 25-year-old vehicle is like 3,000 or 2,000 miles per year. And so we just take exactly what they're assuming in their analysis and just apply it to our data set.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much to your talk. Clearly very interesting to everyone. And thank you to everyone for the engaged questions. Next up, we have Bill Eisele joining us remotely. Bill Eisele is a senior research engineer and mobility division head at the Texas A&M Transportation Institute in College Station, Texas. He leads programmatic areas of mobility analysis, urban analysis, transportation planning, and travel forecasting. With over 27 years of experience, he is a recognized expert in the areas of mobility analysis, congestion monitoring, performance measurement, urban freight, freight mobility, and access management. And the title of his talk today is Planning for a New Mobility Future. Bill, are you all set to go?
I think I'm getting there.
Great, well, we can hear you, so that's good already.
Fantastic. And can you see something?
Yes, we see your slides and we hear you.
Full screen, fantastic. Here we go. Well, first and foremost, sorry that I can't be there. I decided not to share. You may have heard I've got the COVID. So I stayed home and I'm coming to you from my bunker. The good news is I'm feeling a lot better. I tested about 5 days ago and it's not nearly as bad as the first round. So thank goodness for that. But I do have some horrible backache now that I'm trying to work through because I haven't been able to move for a couple of days. So I'm getting through it. So as you said, I'm going to talk about planning for a new mobility future. I'm going to touch on a few things. I think my role here is trying to sum up a little bit, play cleanup hitter on what we've heard, perhaps provide some highlights on a little bit of everything that we've talked about, and perhaps plant some questions as we think about what the future might look like, particularly in regards to the different topics that we've touched on already. I'll probably delve a little bit, can't help myself, into the freight side a little bit more too. I just finished up my second term as chair for TRB's Urban Freight Transportation Committee, and I'm currently the Freight Systems Group chair for freight. So I know you can kind of expect I'll get some freight stuff in there too. And I do want to acknowledge a couple of my colleagues, Mason Cantu, Jordan Gregory, and Carly Venditti, who provided me a few insights on some of the topics too. So just want to give them a shout out. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in. I do a fair amount of media and have opportunities to talk about what our future mobility will look like. And it was really hard in 2019 to talk about what the mobility future might look like. And we've had some things change since then. And, so I think there's probably a whole lot more questions than answers. And I'm probably going to pose some of those. And I'm going to talk about a little bit some of what I'm calling levers that are impacting that future mobility ecosystem that we're all really in. All of these bullets are things I'm going to comment about, and I have a slide or two on each one of these different particular topics, and then I'm going to provide some final thoughts. But I think some of these are really the key levers as I see it when we're talking about what's our future look like and how are we going to plan for that adequately. So the first one, the mobility reset, really the rethink. Gloria touched on some of this. Nearly everyone is rethinking all of their lives in terms of where and how we work and how and where we live and recreate. medical, etc. We all know people who have changed jobs. Sometimes those are in our same household. We all know people who have moved. Sometimes that's your own household. I think certainly what we need to keep in mind here is that not everyone can order online or work from home. And so I think one of the big questions here that still remains is how will these travel patterns and modal choices change really for all neighborhoods, those of us that do have some flexibility and those of us that don't. And I think this is going to play a huge role in our future. And after that, even if we could wave a wand and answer the question of how we travel and had perfect information on when and where, the next question is, how are those products and services going to follow us? Travis touched on this a little bit, but certainly there's a ton of e-commerce that needs to get the goods and services to all of us wherever we may settle and wherever businesses may settle and whatever new business activity looks like, however that settles. So there's yet another aspect of this travel and air quality and health impact on top of that we'll need to trace and continue to trace really as we get to a new normal. And perhaps the new normal is even change at some level. I think if we've learned nothing over the last couple of years is it's we're an adaptive people and we're going to probably have some punches to roll with here. The increased call for electric vehicles, I just want to put a couple of points here in terms of what this might look like in the future and what some of the implications might be. Is it going to be the same as everyone turning on the washer and dryer at the same time every night? What are those implications going to be on the national, state, and grid networks in terms of what the energy might look like? And certainly, we're not talking about emitting harmful gases or vapors, but certainly some of that electricity may come from coal, nuclear, natural gas. So how do we get there? How do we get clean? Are some of the questions as we begin to roll out the electric vehicles. And there's a lot of inequities that follow around this. I don't think I've heard too much about this yet. It was probably on the periphery of some of the comments, but there's inequities amongst the disenfranchised neighborhoods that are being perpetuated by this push for EVs. They really can't afford those vehicles. And so they're being left out of all of those advanced safety benefits that are being promoted. The atmospheric enhancements that are brought on to those physical communities where those things do take place. So that's something to keep in mind. And perhaps there's an opportunity then to look at the patterns of movements in those disenfranchised cities or those locations, to look at how we can focus on long-term sustained planning contact and continue those touch points and incorporate that feedback into our planning process that really makes sure that we're thwarting any kind of mobility gentrification that might be occurring. We've touched on these, and I think Gloria did a good job on these. I maybe didn't necessarily spell out all of these in particular, but these are also the inequities in transportation that we've seen that we have to keep in mind in our new mobility future. Highway construction and displacement that's occurred, inequitable investment, making sure that there's adequate representation of urban areas within our MPO structures, not being totally sold on level of service or delay or whatever a specific performance measure might be to justify the road widening, but rather to be listening to the broad set of needs of the individuals. And then the disproportionate investment and fund prioritization that's often come about as a result of that. So those are some of those inequities that I wanted to point out that I think are still some of the questions that we have in the back of our mind and think challenges that we're still trying to answer. And then there's the whole space of micro mobility and the questions that will come up as it relates to that. So will this become more common to see these small vehicles for short trips in dense environments? And if we do see that, what impact on the environment or neighborhood livability characteristics might we see? Does it take the larger vehicles off the road for such things as convenience or goods delivery? Or do we actually find that it's increasing the vehicles per household as a result of the new technology and new opportunity? Much like a lot of this thing, I think time will tell, especially as we get more intensive in some of our analyses in this post-COVID world, or really this maybe changing new normal that we're in. So having planted some of those seeds, I want to move a little bit into the e-commerce world and what we're seeing with the growth in goods movement. Just putting some facts to this, about 10 years ago, about 5% of US retail sales were driven by e-commerce, and in 2020, we're at 21%. So ridiculously large jump. I think some would say we jumped about 10 years in terms of what we expected, and we sort of flashed forward. And that's going to have tremendous impacts on us. And we saw this in the bottom bullet there, e-commerce growth of about 2 decades in terms of the dollar figure. That's just e-commerce as it relates to business to consumer. When you talk about business to business, it's a huge space. And you start to talk about numbers in the trillions, and those numbers equally have been increasing, and it's about 2.5 times what we talk about when we talk about business to consumer. And then you could take that even further across all digital channels. You're starting to talk about up to $10 trillion, which was a 10% increase in 2020 over 2019. All of this to say that there's probably a whole lot more of that going on than we realize, and that all has implications. Travis touched on some of these, and I'm going to circle back to a couple of them. The reality here, in terms of the private sector and some of the demands and the solutions that they're looking at, they have to make their delivery windows. Right? So when you're clicking on something and saying next day, same day delivery, add to cart, that means that they have to get those products closer to you when you're clicking on purchase now. So what that means is what Travis was talking about. We see some of those logistics centers in some cases moving out to the burbs, but then also in many cases, we're starting to see some of those smaller centers even grow up into the urban areas, because they're constantly trying to answer that question of where do I get my inventory? How much do I need and where? So this is going to have implications on health in terms of probably more trucks to make their turns in some of those cases, or more alternative fueled vehicles in that last mile space. They certainly need access to the curb. I could talk for hours about curb management, but I won't do that. But just making sure that there's a good balance at the curb in order to be able to make those deliveries in a timely manner. And of course, then there's all of the myriad technological solutions that we see that come along with this, including, for example, here I'm showing the Nero last mile deliveries by Pizza, demonstrating pizza delivery in this case in Houston, and they've done this in several different locations. That's just part of the story. Another part of the story in terms of the impact on these deliveries is the packaging waste. And we don't really talk or hear a whole lot about this. It's something that troubles me personally, and I know it's yet another topic that we need to look at on the environmental impacts side of things. But this is just in 2017, we packaged about 165 billion things were shipped. That's pre-pandemic, so the statistics are a lot worse now. But that was about 1 billion trees. This is just one company, meal kits leader, Blue Apron. They sent out about 8 million meals a month, each containing 2 6-ounce ice packs. The freezer pack waste alone is about the weight of 100,000 cars. So 192,000 tons every year. Again, unsustainable, and that's just one company. The UN says that by 2050, there'll be more plastic waste than fish in the sea. We've got a lot of packaging waste right now. A lot of it's ending up in our ocean. You don't have to look too hard to find stories about how plastic waste is in our blood now, and it's snowing plastic in the Antarctica, nanoplastics, et cetera. So it's a big problem. Deliveries aren't necessarily, and I don't want to say that, you know, you clicking, I don't want to scare you too much from your Amazon orders and say that it's all attributed to that. But it's all unsustainable, and it's all continuing, and it's something when we're talking about environmental health that I think it's critical that we keep these things in mind. It's all part of the environment that we're trying to help out here. People will study anything. People probably say that about me. I found some statistics. The average box has dropped 17 times. I've actually picked up some of those deliveries on my porch. You know, the reality is you'll buy something small and it comes in this very big box, right, that you can hardly even get through the door. Well, the reality is we're shipping air in many cases just to make sure that we have the airbags around that. And so all of those statistics that I provided sort of exasperates a lot of that. So there is this growth in a space that's looking at reusable containers, responsible packaging. We're seeing in some businesses, some brands are trying to actually get customers back into the stores. Because if you think about it, there, in many cases, the pandemic had them starting to become the pickers of the product off the shelf, and then also the transportation service to get those goods to you, particularly grocery and a few other things that have continued now post-pandemic. And they're starting to say, I learned last week at a conference that they're starting to learn that they could put these delivery fees on them that people really aren't looking at, and they're starting to make it profitable. But in many cases, it's a onerous on them. So trying to get some of those people to come back into the stores. And we haven't even talked about the reverse logistics. We live in a pretty cavalier society now when it comes to ordering something. If I don't know exactly what I want or what color I want, I'll get that widget in 4 different colors, knowing I can have free return on the other 3. So that's putting a tremendous strain on our system and in our environment as well. The returns, the reselling, the repairs, the repackaging, the recycling, the waste, everything that goes along with that. As we think about technology and we think about what the future might hold in the goods movement and also sort of in our own mobility space, I went out and did a pretty scientific Amazon search of patents. And it's interesting what you can find, joke there about the scientific part. But it's interesting to see what's already being patented and what's already being thought about as we move to urbanized areas and kind of looking over at you virtually, Travis, when they can't get these things into the urban areas and it's highly dense, they're starting to look into the water that might be available or blimps and floating airships. So the underwater warehouse always kind of gets a couple of raised eyebrows, and I'm sure it is now. But just being able to RFID sealed packages, go down and pick them as needed to use those detention ponds, retention ponds, water features, and others, and then of course going up in the air as well. Underground warehouses and conveyors, drones and multi-level fulfillment centers. The stuff isn't necessarily laughable. We just got a zoning request about 3 miles, 2 miles away from my little suburban home that I'm talking to you from here in College Station, Texas, where Amazon is repurposing some property to put in one of these warehousing facilities. A couple of others along these lines, trains with drones that'll go up off of them. So again, if you think about rural settings or even highly urban settings where you can't get a distribution center in, provides a way to access them. And then the drone chute on the right, one of the challenges is the takeoff and landing part, right, in the package. So being able to drop some sort of cone structure that you can then drop the package in, so you don't actually have to do the drop itself. All that to point out, I get a lot of questions about, what about technology X? And I often come back to, again, if it reliably and safely helps the companies hit their delivery windows, it's going to be in the running in terms of the conversation. And that's true across this global supply chain, whatever technology and mode that we might be talking about. And so I think that's why it's so important for us as we think about how do we equitably plan our transportation systems for this? What are the energy needs going to be? How do we maintain a healthy environment? What are the impacts on land use, city planning, building codes, and so much more? So I'm going to leave you with, I got 2 or 3 more slides, but as I thought about a bit of this and really some of the contentions that I see in some of the conversations that we seem to have as we talk about how are we going to get there in the future? How are we going to move forward? I couldn't help but think about all I really needed to know I learned in kindergarten. So I think getting to more sustainable solutions is going to require conversations, a lot more conversations, where we're really understanding the perspectives, backgrounds, feelings, and lived experiences of everybody that we are trying to incorporate into our plans. Options, and that's really all kinds of options, particularly for this audience, energy options. Fleet electrification, power sources. How are we going to power what some of these different modes look like for both personal travel and goods movement? And there is the modes for both goods and passengers, whether it's scooters, robots, public transit, etc. And even looking at consolidation of trips for both freight and vehicles, freight and commuters. I think these conversations are going to require a whole lot more patience and empathy also. Really having sincere care of some of the viewpoints and that we're hearing being brought up and understanding what it needs to partner with all those different stakeholders in order to get somewhere new in terms of the solutions. And speaking of solutions, I would caution, being aware of solutionists, people that come into the conversation sort of with their mind made up, and recognizing we all have those biases and being able to check those at the door before going into some of these conversations. Equity, it's been stated several times, it's going to be stated some more here, in terms of all lived experiences being solicited and incorporated into the planning and solution process. And really, how do we keep our solutions healthy for all? Data analysis, data scientists, the models, the crowdsourcing of data, the driver behaviors, survey information, turning these large data sets into information will certainly always be in our future in this transportation space that we're in. So there's many stakeholders here, all of us certainly in the room and those joining virtually in the public and private space, nonprofits, and us as consumers and customers also, and being responsible consumers, I think is certainly an important part of the messaging also. And really, I frequently will tell people that I'm really only talking to you if you ever travel or if you eat or buy anything. Otherwise, my message really isn't important to you. So yeah, my point is, this is something that is important to all of us and affects every single one of us. So this is my contact information. I mentioned the Transportation Research Board. I'll point your eyes to the middle there. We did a centennial paper, which I think is really nice. If you got a kick out of anything that I mentioned related to the urban freight and goods movement, you might want to take a look at that paper that's out there. I thought that would really reflected pretty well on where we've been, where we're headed. And then there's my contact info and how to get a hold of me, and really look forward to continuing the conversation. with that, that's the end of my prepared remarks.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it, and we're all very glad that you're feeling better. We're sorry you couldn't join us. We do magically still have a few minutes left. I wanted to just first welcome questions directly for Bill, if we had any specific on that talk. And then we can open the floor for a general panel quickly before lunch. Okay. Greg says we should open it up since everybody looks hungry. I suppose I'll ask one quick question. So one of the things that I keep thinking about as we're talking about all this e-commerce and all of the new ways in which we interact with commerce and get our goods is there must be some efficiencies to having centralized, good placement that then goes out to homes as opposed to everybody coming in, from their homes to the stores. But I wonder if, it's just not my area, but has there been a lot of research in that area of trying to understand where the balance is when it's harmful versus, helpful?
I don't know that there's been. I don't know that you need that. I don't know what the research says. I think what we end up with, and we saw this during the pandemic, is this push and pull between humans being very social creatures. And while we can talk about efficiencies, they still want to safely interact with others. And so the idea that they will stay in their homes because of the convenience of having everything brought to them is not a realistic goal, because they don't want that.
Hi, and I think one thing to add as well is considering the question of whether or not commercial vehicle trips or delivery trips are replacing passenger shopping trips that would have already happened or otherwise happened. I think you can point to certain situations and models and what have you, in which you could say, well, it makes more sense that logistics companies spend a lot of money in optimizing those shipments. They spend a lot of money introducing their own VMT rather than passenger travel, which may be more decentralized or atomized. So you can make an argument there. And I think you also have to look maybe a little bit more behaviorally. And there's also research that suggests, okay, what are the goods that people are buying online? Are they goods that they would otherwise have traveled to the store? Or are these new goods an induced demand that they might not have already been making beforehand? So I think the picture then becomes a little bit more muddy as to, are we actually replacing our trips with shopping trips? Surely some might, but ultimately, we're still going to the grocery store. That won't be going away, even if grocery deliveries are increasing at a generally slower pace than just general household items. So I think there's a way to look at it, not just operationally, but also just how we shop in general and behaviorally as well.
Hi, Chad Bailey from EPA's Office of Transportation and Air Quality. This has been a great session, and I hate to be a downer, but deal with this stuff. The transportation system that we have today is evolved over many years, but a lot of the initial bones of the system got built, when we talk about the Eisenhower highway system, that was about a year after Emmett Till got killed. And the 1949 Federal Housing Act, was explicitly segregationist. A lot of the highway alignments that were chosen, we've seen examples of being used to promote urban renewal / Negro removal. White flight and all these things happened. Now, it's kind of hard to, you can't just unbuild highways. So I guess my question is, and that history has resulted in a lot of fights around transportation and a lot of lawsuits around NEPA and things like that. My question is how, if we want to reach equity in transportation and sustainability, how do we fix the future to help address the problems of that past? It's a very difficult question, I know. And so I don't know if anybody's got an answer. I'm just looking for ideas.
Couple of thoughts. Couple of thoughts with respect to that. There's a lot of conversation taking place within those communities that were previously harmed, that they're not interested in fixing the past. They are interested in restorative actions that enable them to move forward. And the assumption being, make up a number, that there were 750 residences removed and 800 businesses removed in a particular community in order to construct. They're not necessarily interested in having all of that replaced. What they may do is an economic analysis that says, here's what the economic impacts were. As we look forward with reinvestment in this area, what we're looking at is this issue of restorative communities. How can investment be made to restore that sense of place and allow it to move forward? Not just focus on, okay, we got to replace 800 households. No. What would have been the economic condition today and going forward? And how do you implement actions? And as maybe the transportation advocate in the room, unfortunately, I believe that transportation touches everybody's life, and we are the 800-pound gorilla, but guess what? We don't hold all the solutions. You can beat us into submission to do A, B, and C. The reality is that land use still has to be fixed. This issue of both physical environment and natural environment and economic environment has to be fixed. The social environment. I know of instances where there's a blank stare when you say gentrification shouldn't occur. They're going, it's not my job as a transportation professional to not allow Polka Dot to sell their home for goo gobs of money, not recognizing that the improvements that we put in will raise the property tax. And as a homeowner, they may be able to make their mortgage payments, they may be able to make whatever their taxes are, but the incremental increase because of the improvements that were made for the transportation system, they can't absorb. Or they inherited the house from grandma, and so they don't have a mortgage, what they have is the property taxes, but they can't afford the incremental increase. It's recognizing those and being proactive rather than reactive, that that's going to occur, and putting systems in place.
All right, great, thank you. Want to take a moment to thank all the panelists for the great conversation today, to all of you for sticking around right until lunch, and to the HEI staff for helping us organize this great session. So thank you all.